inversión, macro, bolsa, cripto y mercados. En Más que Mercados, analizamos la actualidad, las últimas noticias y todos los factores que afectan a tus inversiones.
La educación financiera cambia vidas.
De lunes a jueves a las 3:30 p.m. hora española, el mejor programa de economía, inversión y trading de habla hispana. Cada día podrás ver la operativa en vivo y en directo. Acompáñanos con la guía experta de José y Álvaro Basagoiti y analiza con nuestros invitados las mejores estrategias de inversión y los portafolios corporativos de su firma. También podrás hacer tus propias consultas sobre acciones y mercados en tiempo real. Únete a nosotros de lunes a jueves a las 3:30 hora española y no te pierdas las mejores entrevistas e invitados. Descubre cómo hacer crecer tu patrimonio de manera inteligente solo en Más que Mercados de TradingPRO TV.
Muy buenas, arrancamos este especial de Powell, segunda ración que tenemos hoy de Más que Mercados, ¿verdad? Hemos estado ya operando la apertura de Wall Street en directo como siempre y ahora mismo vamos a escuchar a Jay Powell, ¿verdad? Va a hablar el presidente de la Reserva Federal, es en Stanford, una conferencia muy interesante después, sobre todo, de los últimos datos de inflación, que pues, a mucha parte de la sociedad le preocupa. Va a empezar, creo que en 10 minutos le tendremos, si no hay retrasos. Sabemos que Powell pues, a veces le da por llegar 3, 4, 5 minutos tarde, pero bueno, me lo guiarán por el micro, así que estaremos, nada más empiece, con él. ¿Qué puede comentar hoy Powell? Bueno, tema de inflación, ¿vale? El petróleo, que sigue disparado. Antes hemos comentado porque además somos alcistas en el medio y largo plazo para el petróleo. La OPEP Plus, incluido Rusia, está haciendo una guerra a Estados Unidos. Biden ha tratado de manipular a la baja el petróleo, liberando las reservas estratégicas, pero se ha quedado sin ellas y la OPEP sigue teniendo músculo para recortar la producción. De hecho, la ha extendido durante todo este segundo trimestre, por lo tanto es normal que quieran tener o que vayan a mantener el precio del petróleo por encima de 80, incluso en los entornos de 90. La figura técnica que tenemos en el petróleo además es muy alcista. Además tenemos repunte en los servicios, el IPC Core sigue bueno, no disparado, pero sigue en una dinámica preocupante, ¿no? Niveles del 3% que están muy alejados del objetivo del 2%. Y el IPC general también repuntando en los últimos meses. Es decir, seguimos con la inflación descontrolada. Puede ser otra narrativa, otro discurso, pero esta es la realidad. Sin embargo, Powell dice que todo va bien, que puede haber baches en el camino. Usó esta expresión en su última reunión, baches en el camino, pero que seguimos por la buena senda. Eso dijo Powell, pero vamos a ver si hoy cambia de discurso. Estuvo muy dovish la última vez. El discurso dovish provocó un rally tremendo en bolsas y caídas fuertes del dólar. Vamos a ver hoy qué impacto tiene en los mercados. Evidentemente, si mantiene su tonalidad dovish, complaciente, suave, esto apoyará la tendencia alcista en bolsas. Bien, y será negativo para el dólar. Cuidado, si tiene un discurso un poco más agresivo, que sería lo normal, ¿no? Después de los últimos acontecimientos. Pues oye, ya no digo que vaya a cambiar de guidance, ¿no? Que vaya a recortar o a recortar menos tipos de interés de lo que se espera, o que vaya a atrasar el QE. No digo que cambie el guidance, pero desde luego sí el tono del discurso. Sería habitual verlo un poco hawkish, porque es que el mercado lo requiere. Decía Ben Bernanke que una cosa muy peligrosa para la inflación, para retroalimentar la inflación, es el efecto riqueza. Y el hecho de ver las bolsas, el oro, Bitcoin, todo en máximos históricos, no es nada bueno porque hace, el efecto de que la gente es más rica porque el valor de los activos sube, entonces la gente se siente más rica y consume más. Y esto pues no es bueno para una inflación que, como os he comentado, está descontrolada, con el tesoro gastando como si no hubiera mañana. Esto es muy inflacionario, y el petróleo en los 85. Pues quizá tenga que tomar el control Jay Powell, que es su mandato, controlar la inflación y tener un tono agresivo. Por lo tanto, si hoy vemos un Powell hawkish, halcón, agresivo, esto puede generar tensión en el mercado de bonos y tensión en el mercado de renta variable. Es decir, puede generar caídas en las bolsas. De hecho, hoy, en Más que Mercados, hemos vendido DAX. Ahora vamos a ver, fijaos cómo está Powell ya, ahí lo veis en pantalla, ya está arrancando el discurso el presidente de la Reserva Federal. Hemos dado algún detalle de lo que puede decir, pero bueno, mejor que yo analice. Creo que vamos a escuchar en directo, así que lo vamos a pantalla completa. Vamos a escuchar al presidente de la Fed, Jerome Powell.
Core inflation, which excludes the volatile food and energy components, stood at 2.8% in February. A year ago, it was 4.8%. So this is very welcome progress, but as you can see, the job of sustainably restoring 2% inflation is not yet done. Tight monetary policy continues to weigh on demand, particularly in interest-sensitive spending categories. Nonetheless, growth in economic activity and employment was strong in 2023, as real GDP expanded by more than 3%, and 3 million jobs were created, even as inflation fell substantially. This combination of outcomes reflects significant improvements in supply that offset to some extent the effects on demand of tighter financial conditions. The healing of global supply chains helped address pent-up demand for goods, particularly in sectors that had faced considerable shortages, such as autos. In addition, labor supply increased significantly thanks to rising participation among 25 to 54-year-olds, workers in their prime working years, as well as a strong pace of immigration. Recent readings on both job gains and inflation have come in higher than expected. The economy added in an average of 265,000 jobs per month in the 3 years through February, a faster pace than we have seen since last June. And the higher inflation data over January and February were above the low readings in the second half of last year. But these recent data do not, however, materially change the overall picture, which continues to be one of solid growth, a strong but rebalancing labor market, and inflation moving down toward 2% on a sometimes bumpy path. Labor market rebalancing is evident in many parts of the data, including quits, job openings, surveys of employers and workers, and the continued gradual decline in wage growth. On inflation, it is too soon to say whether the recent readings represent more than just a bump. We do not expect that it will be appropriate to lower our policy rate until we have greater confidence that inflation is moving sustainably down toward 2%. Given the strength of the economy and progress on inflation so far, we have time to let the incoming data guide our decisions on policy. We've held our policy rate at its current level since last July. As shown in the individual projections that the FOMC released just 2 weeks ago, my colleagues and I continue to believe that the policy rate is likely at its peak for this tightening cycle. If the economy evolves broadly as we expect, most FOMC participants see it as likely to be appropriate to begin lowering the policy rate at some point this year. Of course, that outlook is still quite uncertain, and we face risks on both sides. Reducing rates too soon or too much could result in a reversal of the progress we've seen on inflation and ultimately require even tighter policy to get inflation back to 2%. But easing policy too late or too little could unduly weaken economic activity and employment. As progress on inflation continues and labor market tightness eases, these risks continue to move into better balance. As conditions evolve, monetary policy is well positioned to confront either of these risks. We are making decisions meeting by meeting, and we'll do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. And that brings me to my second topic. The Fed has been assigned 2 goals for monetary policy: maximum employment and stable prices. Our success in delivering on these goals matters a great deal to all Americans. To support our pursuit of these goals, Congress granted the Fed a substantial degree of independence in our conduct of monetary policy. Fed policymakers serve long terms that are not synchronized with election cycles. Our decisions are not subject to reversal by other parts of the government other than through legislation. This independence both enables and requires us to make our policy decisions without consideration of short-term political matters. Such independence for a federal agency is and should be rare. In the case of the Fed, independence is essential to our ability to serve the public. The record shows that independent central banks deliver better economic outcomes. We recognize that we need to continually earn this grant of independence, and we do so by carrying out our work with technical competence and objectivity in a transparent and accountable manner, and by sticking to our knitting. By technical competence, I mean that the Fed policymakers use the most up-to-date information and research to deepen our understanding of the ever-evolving economy and to reliably deliver on our assigned goals. We're supported by a highly capable staff We also draw on the insights and experiences of a wide array of business, academic, community, and labor leaders, as well as others engaged in the economy. And by objective, I mean that our analysis is free from any personal or...
Bueno, estamos escuchando al amigo Powell, vamos a decir, traducido al español, claro que sí, los puntos más importantes que está diciendo, de momento reaccionando ligeramente a la baja al mercado. Ya sabéis que nosotros antes, en el programa Más que Mercados, hemos entrado cortos en el SP500, está yendo bastante bien esa operación. Bueno, Powell, tres frases que hay que tener en cuenta. Dice que las perspectivas, aún bastante inciertas, dice que la Fed se enfrenta a riesgos en ambos lados de su mandato, ¿vale? Y estos riesgos continuarán avanzando hacia un mejor equilibrio, ¿vale? De momento sigue viendo todavía un futuro bastante incierto Powell. Dice que el reequilibrio del mercado laboral se observan los datos sobre la renuncia, ofertas de empleo, encuestas a empleadores y trabajadores, y una disminución gradual continúa en el crecimiento salarial. Tenemos un dato muy importante, ya sabéis, a tasa de desempleo. Este viernes lo conoceremos, también estaremos, por supuesto, bueno, en el directo, en Telegram, con esos datos y la reacción en los mercados. Y también muy importante decir que, declaraciones también de Powell, que la economía aún tiene un crecimiento sólido, sigue viendo un mercado laboral también muy resiliente, mercado laboral fuerte pero reequilibrado, dice, y una inflación que va a la baja al objetivo, que todavía dice que es el 2%, dice que es difícil conseguirlo, pero que está yendo un buen camino. De buen tono algo dovish el que está diciendo Powell, que por cierto vamos a seguir escuchándole.
And in visits to communities around the country as part of an extensive outreach in which we seek input from individuals and groups throughout society. Transparency is an affirmative and proactive commitment to the public. Lastly, to maintain the public's trust, we also need to avoid mission creep. Our nation faces many challenges, some of which directly or indirectly involve the economy. Fed policymakers are often pressed to take a position on issues that are arguably relevant to the economy, but are not within our mandate, such as, for example, particular tax and spending policies, immigration policy, and trade policy. Climate change is another current example. Policies to address climate change are the business of elected officials and those agencies that they have charged with this responsibility. The Fed has received no such charge. We do, however, have a narrow role that relates to our responsibilities as a bank supervisor. The public will expect that the institutions that we regulate and supervise will understand and be able to manage the material risks that they face, which over time are likely to include climate-related financial risks. We will remain alert to the risk that there will be pressure to expand that role over time, but we are not, nor do we seek to be, climate policymakers. In short, doing our job well requires that we respect the limits of our mandate. Thank you. I'll stop there and look forward to our discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chair Powell, for those remarks and for taking some time to be with us and talk to us today. There's a lot of stuff going on in the world today. I think we have a lot of stuff to talk about, so I'm going to get right into it. Before I get started, I just want to also thank you to the audience for sending questions over. What I've done is I've tried to organize the conversation around two themes. One, we'll start by talking about the macroeconomy, and then you have been shared through a very tumultuous period over the last 5 years, and I want to talk about the leadership challenges around that. So let me just dive right into it, pick up on something you started talking about, which is inflation. 2 years ago, we had inflation readings close to 6-7%. We've come down to 3%. Last Friday, the PCE inflation index, the personal consumption expenditure inflation index, which is something that the Fed often speaks about, came in at 2.8%. We've had a conversation about this. There's so many factors that have been play in the economy over the last couple of years. I wonder if you can just spend some time talking to us about what you think are the key factors that have brought inflation down over the last 2 years.
Sure. So I think I'll start with where we think the inflation came from. So what is actually different this time, at the risk of making that statement, is that this inflation wasn't strictly just a question of demand overheating and the Fed coming in and having to suppress demand. That's been the more typical pattern, perhaps on the back of a a shock such as oil price shock and that kind of thing. This episode actually also involved, as everyone will recall, the collapse of the supply side in a lot of ways. So supply chains stopped working. There were shortages of critical things like semiconductors, which turned out you couldn't make cars. I think many of us might not have realized how many semiconductors go into a car. In addition, there was a major labor force shock. So we lost several million people out of the labor market. So we had a very severe labor shortage. So it was a supply side issue, as well as overheated demand from the closing and then reopening of the economy at a time when rates were low and fiscal policy was very supportive of demand. So we had both of those things. And therefore, if those were the causes, what we needed to see was both the unwinding of the pandemic-related distortions to both the supply and demand in the economy, and also the effects of tight monetary policy. So today, what we think we're seeing as inflation has come down sharply over the last year is those two factors working together. And they do work together. We think that tight monetary policy weighing on demand actually gives the supply side a better chance to recover. And 2023, of course, was a year, as I mentioned, of very significant supply side recovery and expansion.
And what are the factors that you're keeping an eye on, say, over the next few years, maybe the next year or two, that might play out in the inflation picture?
I should also mention inflation expectations, which in our framework and in the thinking of most monetary economists, people think that having the public expect inflation to return to 2% despite it moving up, that's a very important factor in bringing inflation back down. In a sense, if people believe it, that price setters and wage setters in the economy, if they believe that inflation will be 2%, then that'll actually happen. So as we look ahead, though, one question is how much more juice is there to come out of the supply side recovery? We got a very large increase in population last year, which may have helped with inflation. It certainly helped with output, and it increased the potential output. At the same time, the economy is growing 3.1% last year. Around that, we also had inflation coming down sharply. So there may be more supply side gains to be had. Surveys of businesses still show difficulties in hiring people, difficulties in getting the inputs that they need for their businesses. So there's some more benefit there. We also think that monetary policy is tight. It's weighing on interest-sensitive spending in the economy. So, for example, durable goods, surveys of consumers will say that it's a tough time to buy durable goods because rates are high. You also see the labor market rebalancing because you can look at demand in the labor market as well as supply, but you see demand reflected in lower job openings, a very small increase in unemployment, in wages moving back down toward more sustainable levels. So we think those two forces that I mentioned will be the ones we'll be looking for. And the thing we'll be looking at, of course, is the incoming data on inflation as those affect the outlook. And the same thing about the labor market. What's happening in the labor market? Does it suggest that the labor market is continuing its progress, and it's made substantial progress, to get back to a sustainable level of wage growth and balance between supply and demand?
Can I just dig into the inflation expectations point you mentioned? An analogy that people drew a couple years ago was to the high inflation episode of the 70s, where we had a high inflation period that then ended up shifting expectations, then through the wage price mechanism ended up leading to a sustained period of high inflation. In the current situation, I guess I have two questions. How concerned are you about maybe inflation getting stuck in the upper twos, around 3? Could that last mile be very hard because inflation expectations getting stuck? And then relatedly, are there things you're looking at to tell you, to signal to you that that is an issue or isn't an issue?
Right, so as I mentioned, inflation expectations, we think, are an important part of driving actually inflation. And we want them to be at levels that are consistent with 2% inflation over time. Not 3%, but 2%, not 2.5%. The good news is that that's where they are right now and pretty much have been for some time. And we look at surveys of businesses, households, forecasters. We look at other kinds of measures of inflation expectations, model-based and things like that. We also look at market-based. The market is always buying and selling inflation protection, and you can get from that expectation of, or assessment of what markets expect. And all of those are pretty consistently saying that the public does believe, and it's a good thing because it's true, that inflation will go back down to 2%. So that's very assuring, but that's partly because of the very strong action.
Bueno, estábamos escuchando a Powell, me hacía mucha gracia, porque decía que pues el buen camino era que la dinámica en los salarios era que se estaban más o menos parando, ¿no? Que no estaba entrando esa espiral precios-salarios que tanto preocupa a la banca central. Básicamente, lo que quiere decir esto es que en términos reales los salarios no están bajando, no están subiendo al mismo ritmo que la inflación, es decir, todos los trabajadores están empobreciendo. Y eso lo ve como algo positivo para vencer la inflación. Claro, el impuesto invisible, ¿no? Básicamente cuando los salarios no suben al mismo ritmo que la inflación. Hombre, visto con el prisma de inflación es bueno, pero con el prisma del crecimiento es terrible, ¿no? Pero bueno, eso estaba diciendo Powell, me hacía mucha gracia. Tono dovish, de hecho está cayendo el dólar, y las bolsas pues recuperando parte de lo que habían perdido. Vamos a ver, si os parece, los gráficos, a ver un poco el impacto que está teniendo este discurso. Luego vamos a ver con Powell, que está muy interesante. Pero mira, aquí tenéis una de las plataformas que tenemos en TradingPRO, ya sabéis. Y fijaros, el Nasdaq está en una zona de cortos desde mi punto de vista muy interesante. Habíamos hablado ya de la distribución o precio de techo profesional de mercado. Hoy, después de los datos de empleo, unos datos de empleo positivos, ha subido bastante el precio y claramente esperando a Powell ha fallado en la zona del 61,8, que además coincidía con la clavicular de la distribución y para mí zona de cortos. Sin embargo, el tono dovish de momento de Powell diciendo que es el buen camino, que habrá algún bache, pero que siguen por la buena senda de la inflación, pues está haciendo que lo que había perdido justo antes lo esté recuperando. Pero desde mi punto de vista muy engañoso. No está siendo hawkish, pero tampoco dovish, porque dice que aún queda mucho, que habrá que seguir los próximos datos a la hora de tomar decisiones de política monetaria, es decir, mucho más, menos, algo más incierto que, por ejemplo, el BCE. El BCE dejó muy claro, a través de varios de sus miembros, que iba a haber 2 recortes de tipos antes de verano, antes de agosto. De momento Powell deja la puerta abierta a que no haya tipos. Yo estaba siguiendo ahora los swaps de los Fed Funds, los swaps de los fondos federales, y dan de momento la probabilidad es que haya 2,68 recorte de tipos, ¿vale? Es decir, un poquito menos de 3 ahora mismo es lo que están marcando. Así que de momento, insisto, hay más incertidumbre con la Fed que con el BCE. Desde mi punto de vista, lo que quiero decir, a pesar del tono no hawkish, vamos a decirlo así, de Powell, desde nuestro punto de vista, y lo comentábamos antes, la zona en el Nasdaq es de cortos. ¿Para qué? Para buscar el módulo. Primer impulso, la corrección, y el segundo impulso bajista proporcional al primero, que vaya a completar el imán que nos deja esta distribución por Wyckoff. Es un poco lo que esperamos. No cambia un poco la estructura técnica porque no está siendo tampoco muy dovish Powell. No está siendo hawkish, pero tampoco muy dovish. Por lo tanto, no está teniendo mucho impacto en la renta variable. Ahora vamos a ver el mercado de bonos, que creo que es el que mejor lo refleja, pero sabéis que antes hemos entrado en apertura cortos en DAX. Vamos a ver, pues si alguien no ha visto la posición, en la posición corta en DAX que tenemos. Esto va muy relacionado, o muy correlacionado, mejor dicho, con esa posición esa estrategia bajista que tenemos para el Nasdaq. En el DAX ya estamos cortos, hemos entrado hoy ligeramente en pérdidas. Este es el stop, este es el profit, es decir, asumimos un ratio asimétrico y positivo que iremos comentando en próximos días. Si alguien nos está viendo hoy de primeras esta comparecencia de Powell, que sepáis que estamos de lunes a jueves en aperturas de Wall Street operando en vivo, tanto por parte macro como por técnica. Luego, el dólar se está sintiendo resentido. El dólar se está sintiendo resentido porque no está siendo hawkish Powell. Había muchos economistas como yo, bueno, pues gente de mi entorno, quizá algo más austríaco, los que nos seguimos pensando que la economía pinta algo en todo esto de la política monetaria. Esperábamos un Powell hoy algo más agresivo, sobre todo visto los últimos datos de inflación y el petróleo en entornos de 85, está cotizando ahora mismo los 85. Sin embargo, Powell, creo que presionado mucho por el Tesoro, que sigue emitiendo mucha deuda y necesita de la ayuda de la Reserva Federal para financiar ese déficit de forma más barata, para que el coste financiero es algo mayor. Creo que Powell, por desgracia, está cayendo en la chaqueta de Arthur Vance, no de Paul Volcker, que ha sido siempre su gran ídolo, ¿no? Bueno, pues caídas del dólar, de momento la bolsa muy quieta, el mercado de bonos también tranquilo, y sobre todo eso. Fijaros hoy, por ejemplo, el euro, aquí lo tenemos en pantalla, las subidas que se están pegando, es decir, caídas del dólar. O sea, quizá el mercado más volátil está siendo el mercado cambiario, el mercado del Forex. De momento, subidas muy fuertes del euro, aunque yo no me las creo. Yo a medio y largo plazo sigo siendo muy bajista para el par euro dólar, porque no olvidemos lo que he comentado. En el BCE descuenta ya 4 recortes de tipos, la Reserva Federal menos de 3. Y esto tarde o temprano se pondrá en precio. Yo creo que habrá un repricing tarde o temprano, porque de momento, desde mi punto de vista, visto la renta variable o visto el componente de los bonos, creo que en parte del mercado sigue pensando de que habrá 4 o 3 recortes de tipos en Estados Unidos. Algo muy difícil si vemos los datos económicos. Otra cosa es que confirmemos que estamos en una dominancia fiscal, que es los políticos los que mandan a Powell, y eso será lapidar la futura credibilidad de la Reserva Federal. Bueno, dicho esto, está hablando Powell, quiero escucharle, así que volvemos a conectar con el presidente de la Fed, que está diciendo cosas muy interesantes, a ver si cambia el tono. Vamos con él.
Typically, the Census Bureau does all this estimating. The Congressional Budget Office actually went and took a different path and talked to the people who work at the border and that kind of thing, and got a much higher estimate, which now many groups have gone out to validate. And I would say it's clear there's something there. The numbers are actually higher. And that actually explains what we've been asking ourselves, which is how can the economy have grown over 3% in a year where almost every outside economist was forecasting a recession? An overwhelming majority anyway were forecasting a recession for 2023. Not only did that not happen, we had better than 3% growth. So really a remarkable performance, and some part of that is that there are significantly more people working in the country, but then how does inflation come down? It's because the capacity of the economy has actually moved up perhaps more than the actual output. So it's a bigger economy, but not a tighter one. Really an unexpected and unusual thing. Again, we don't make judgment calls, but that's what we're seeing.
So it's interesting in this discussion we've had about inflation and unemployment. We have talked about real factors, immigration, supply chain healing. That's the stuff that seems to have played out. We haven't really talked about interest rates per se, which is of course the primary tool of the Federal Reserve. It looks from the outside like the interest rate sensitivity of the economy in this cycle has been very muted, very different than in the past. There's also, you look at the economy, that look like there's very differential impacts across different parts of the economy. The housing market, people have long-term fixed rate mortgages, so interest rate pass-through there is very low. Here in Silicon Valley, we have early stage growth businesses where the cost of capital is affected by the higher rates. And there it looks like we have a much bigger impact. So I wonder if you can speak about the interest rate sensitivity of the economy in this cycle. And then another question, a related question, which is we have differential impact across the economy. How do you think about balancing the impact of interest rate hikes on different sectors?
So I guess the headline for me would be that I do think monetary policy is working and working broadly as expected. I think you can point to sectors of the economy, and you mentioned a couple. So if you're a household that has a low interest mortgage, you're not feeling the effect of higher mortgage rates. And many companies as well took the opportunity to term out their debt before rates went up. So you have a lot of companies that have longer term fixed rate debt at pretty low rates, and they're not as affected by it. That's all true. At the same time, again, if you look at interest-sensitive spending, either in housing or durable goods, you're seeing very significant effects there. And I do think you see the economy rebalancing. So I think it's not right and maybe too soon to conclude that there's some significant disconnect there in terms of monetary policy transmission. But it still leaves the question of how the economy can have grown over 3% during a year in which the federal funds rate is at a quarter-century high. Why wouldn't growth have been lower? And to me, the answer to that is the supply side recovery. I think that's what people need to understand, is that you have this force from outside. It's not just interest rates and demand. You've got a supply side recovery that is creating new demand and new supply. And that's why you get a number like 3.1% at the same time inflation is coming down. One of the reasons why. So I think that's really the story. It's not that the policy isn't restrictive, and it's not that the economy is not responsive to rates. It's that we've had this outside force that is temporarily affecting that.
So if I benchmark Fed policy right now, We have rates at 5.3%. Inflation is running a little bit under 3%. That's like a 2.5%.
Bueno, aquí tenemos a Powell con esa postura de político, ¿verdad? Me hace gracia como siempre se sientan todos igual. Bueno, vamos a decir también uno de los puntos también más importantes que estaba comentando. Fijaos Powell, dice que la inflación ha sido causada por el lado de la oferta y que el colapso del mercado laboral ha sido causado por la pandemia. Han mencionado varias veces la pandemia, el COVID. Dice que pues, se provocó diferentes presiones inflacionarias también anteriores y ha tenido todo pues, un impacto terrible en lo que hemos vivido en los últimos años. Dice que el aumento, cuidado con esto, el aumento de la inmigración ha ayudado a la producción en el mercado laboral. No sé si los votantes de Donald Trump van mucho en la línea de todo esto, ya sabéis, la que tiene montada en Texas con el tema de la inmigración. Ojo, dice la Reserva Federal todavía está en camino de recortar tasas a pesar de los signos de inflación. Insisto, mensaje un poco dobis. Aquí voy a dar yo mi opinión. Yo creo que esto está echándole un cable a Biden. Ya sabéis que tenemos año electoral y a que luzca un pelín mejor su campaña, que de momento está siendo una campaña completamente fallida. Insisto que volvemos a decir que muchas veces la Sociedad Federal, amiga, en este caso del gobierno demócrata parece. Dice también, le han preguntado por el clima. Últimamente da igual lo que sea, que le preguntan por el clima, cambio climático, este pensamiento único que estamos viendo. Bueno, ha dicho que en cuanto al clima, claro, la pilla yo un poco a contrapié a Powell. Dice que en cuanto al clima, la Reserva Federal tiene un papel limitado, obviamente como supervisor bancario, pero que con el tiempo probablemente vayan teniendo un impacto un poco mayor, ya que el sistema financiero pues tendrá riesgos relacionados con el clima. Ya sabéis que ahora llega este eclipse solar, sobre todo en Estados Unidos, y tiene en estado de emergencia algunos estados americanos. Bueno, veremos también, hablaremos de ese eclipse solar. Para hacer un pequeño resumen, ya seguimos escuchando a Powell. Dice que las expectativas de inflación son consistentes, yendo al rumbo del 2%, que el mercado laboral se está reequilibrando, que la política monetaria de momento sigue siendo estricta, que la economía tiene un crecimiento sólido, el mercado laboral es fuerte y la inflación desciende hasta el objetivo del 2%, y que eso sí, las perspectivas son todavía muy inciertas y por lo tanto la propia Fed se enfrenta a riesgos en ambos lados de su mandato. Estos riesgos continúan moviéndose hacia ese mejor equilibrio que buscan. Dicho este resumen, vamos a seguir escuchando al presidente de la Reserva Federal.
But then knowing what the risks are and having the committee be in a position to be able to address those should they materialize. And I think we're very much in that position now.
Maybe I can just follow up on that. So I'm going to ask a question about, is there a signal or a data point that you're paying particular attention to over the next year? And I'm going to ask it this way. So if you had a crystal ball that you knew could perfectly answer one question about the next 12 months, what question would you ask it? What's the thing you really want to know?
Sorry, there's no one thing. It really is. We have a dual mandate. You're asking me to be single-minded about the dual mandate.
No, just kind of a data point that you think will guide you.
Can't do that. No, I mean, we have to, I would say this, in our framework, the two goals, price stability and maximum employment, are equal under the law. But our framework literally says that if you're very far from achieving one of the goals and the other one is pretty much at goal or even better than goal, then you focus on the one that's far from goal. This is obvious, right? So, and that's what we did after inflation came up in March of 21, and then we really had a very tight focus, and you heard us talking about, getting inflation under control. But as inflation has come down, the two things are moving back into balance, and we're not a single mandate bank. The key thing I'll end with, though, is price stability it gives us the ability to achieve both goals. If we don't have price stability, then we're not going to have these long periods of tight labor markets, which benefit everyone. What we saw in the 10-year, 8-month expansion that ended with the pandemic was, for the last 2 or 3 years, the people at the lower end of the income spectrum were getting the largest wage increases. And you saw the gaps between black and white unemployment go to historic lows. So a tight labor market over a long period of time does enormous social good. And that's what we all want to do, is we want to get back to that. For that, you need price stability. But so the two of them actually are quite complementary.
I'm going to shift from just talking about the near term to the thinking about the longer term for the U.S. economy. We've had a pretty big shift in growth expectations for long-run growth. This comes out from the Fed's own projections as well as from economic forecasters' projections. For 15 years ago, long-term growth forecasts were 2.8%, 3%. Pre-pandemic, they've been below 2. That's kind of where they've been for long-term growth forecast. That's where your own forecasts have been. Why do you think that is? Why long-term growth at 2%? We're sitting in Silicon Valley. AI is all the buzz here. We've had high growth over the last few years. Is 2 a reasonable number? Is it possible we could go back to the 2.83% that we had in the early 2000s?
So let me start by saying that sort of every bit of the economy is difficult to forecast. There isn't one that's more difficult to forecast than productivity, for example, which is one of the key elements of longer-term growth. So it's very, very, very uncertain. I mean, basically, what longer-term growth is a function of growth in hours worked and of output per hour. And hours worked is really a function of demographics and more than anything else. And productivity, output per hour, is highly unpredictable. So I think people lowered their longer run growth expectations to around, I guess, 1.8% is the median, something below 2%. That's given what had been our very low population growth and expectations that productivity might be 1.5%, 1.5% kind of thing, productivity growth in output per hour. That's a pretty good place to be. We've had higher productivity than that recently, and the question is it going to be a sustained thing? Are we going to enter into a new period of higher productivity? That would be great. It is productivity growth that lifts, all boats, generation upon generation. And so people argue AI can be that effect. Some people are arguing that there were a lot of business starts at the beginning of the pandemic and during the pandemic, as Americans went out and started businesses at that time, and also that you've seen a lot of change in the labor force. So people moving, quitting, going to better jobs that might be better suited to their skills. But all of those things, they could become a longer run productivity increase or not. Those might just be the things that we need to get 1.5% productivity, and it is unknowable. And particularly with AI, the range of potential outcomes, it should increase productivity. Everyone sees that, but that's not what we're seeing in the numbers now. It's too soon for AI to be affecting, I think, the productivity numbers. But the logic of it is that it could actually, increase productivity. And then the question will be, what does it do to labor? Is it going to replace labor or augment labor or both? And if so, in what proportion? So hard to say about longer run growth, but of course, it would be great if that were the case.
And then just to follow up, we talked about this before. Do you feel like you need to take a stand on this in policy making at current?
No, I mean, so our focus, the things that are really important to the U.S. economy over time are productivity, immigration, even trade policy, industrial, the things that we're doing, industrial policy that is now a thing. Those are important to the longer run growth and economic well-being of Americans. And what we do is we try to move the economy towards stable prices and maximum employment through the business cycle. That's what we can do with business rate, with monetary policy. We are also a crisis responder. We're a really important crisis responder. We can get there quickly. We have great tools for it. So that's a key thing that we do. We also regulate and supervise the banks, and it's important, and we look after financial stability. So all those are very important things, but they're not things that affect the longer run potential output of the United States. So honestly though, the question of what will be the equilibrium interest rate, the neutral interest rate going forward, doesn't really matter for policy today. We're really asking about, once the pandemic is well and truly behind us, and we're well into the AI investment boom and the effects of AI, what will that look like? And it doesn't really matter that much for getting inflation down to 2% while keeping the economy growing and the labor market strong.
Can I shift tax and talk about some of the challenges of leading the Fed through the last 5 years? So, just in our discussion, and it's clear from looking at the world, you've had so many different shocks. Economies behaved in so much unusual ways over the last few years. You were appointed Fed chair in 2018. I remember pre-pandemic, the dominant concern of the Fed was low inflation, not high inflation. It was having inflation below target, below the 2% target.
Bueno, le preguntan a Powell si tuviera la bola de cristal, ¿qué querría saber, no? Ojalá tuviéramos nosotros. Powell no es futurólogo, nosotros tampoco, pero estaría bien saber cómo va a cerrar S&P 500, ¿verdad?, a final de año, o en caso de Powell, si realmente vamos a ver la inflación en el 2% a final de este año. A mí me da que no. Powell se reía, ¿verdad? Ojalá tuviésemos la bola de cristal, pero bueno, aquí esto no es un tarot bursátil, no somos futurólogos, así que habrá que ir dato por dato y vigilar un poco de todas las corrientes macroeconómicas. Para eso están los economistas y, por supuesto, para eso está la legión de muy buenos economistas que tiene la Reserva Federal. A pesar de que Powell no es economista, es abogado, pero desde luego tiene un equipo muy potente, así que bueno, pues si nosotros hacemos predicciones, imaginaos ellos, ¿no? Bueno, iremos viendo, la pregunta también por la inteligencia artificial. La verdad es que es verdad que es quizá el salvavidas que puede tener ahora mismo Estados Unidos, que está emitiendo muchísima deuda, y la deuda no es mala per se si se apoya en producción. Bien, entonces este estallido de productividad, como decía el propio Powell, que puede traer la inteligencia artificial, puede, insisto, más o menos salvar este exceso de deuda que está emitiendo a Estados Unidos y que puede degradar la confianza del propio dólar o la confianza como país de Estados Unidos. Sin embargo, si esta deuda va acompañada de producción, de productividad, por tanto, bueno, pues puede salvar un poco, puede responder o justificar, perdón, esa espiral de deuda en el que está entrando. Así que, pues hacía mención, quizás sea la variable que necesita Estados Unidos para aguantar estos niveles de endeudamiento en términos reales que está teniendo, sobre todo después del COVID. Parece que se ha normalizado déficits del 5, 6, 7, 8%. Es verdad que esto no es cosa de Powell, es cosa de Janet Yellen, la secretaria del Tesoro de Estados Unidos, pero desde luego van muy de la mano. Ya sabemos que no hay independencia, no existe la independencia entre Tesoro y Banca Central, aunque algunos lo digan, no hay tal, ¿no? Y creer en eso es como creen los Reyes Magos, disculpad, pero eso no existe, ¿no? Entonces va muy de la mano el déficit, la deuda, con lo que puede hacer, bueno, en este caso la Reserva Federal, y por eso es tan importante que pueda llegar un catalizador de productividad como puede ser la IA. Cuidado que esta madrugada, sabéis que hemos tenido un terremoto bastante importante en Taiwán y había mucha preocupación. Taiwán, sabéis, la isla, el actor más importante de los semiconductores, con, bueno, pues con la empresa más importante y por lo tanto uno de los actores más importantes es la inteligencia artificial. Veremos si esto afecta en algo, pero desde luego esto ya lo dejo a vosotros, lo que lo estáis viendo. ¿Creéis que la inteligencia artificial de verdad va a generar este estallido tan brutal en la productividad que puede salvar todo este exceso de deuda? Es una pregunta que nos hacemos todo. Además, estamos ante una revolución diferente, porque la tecnología ha reemplazado el trabajo humano. Por ejemplo, pensar en una excavadora, ¿no? Antes cogíamos la pala y nosotros éramos los que excavamos los hoyos, y luego, bueno, pues llegó la tecnología, la maquinaria, y reemplazó el trabajo humano. Pero la inteligencia artificial es diferente, porque no reemplaza el trabajo, sino que reemplaza el pensamiento humano. Así que estamos quizá ante una variable que nadie conoce. No sabemos el futuro de lo que puede traer la IA. Se está poniendo en precio como que va a ser una revolución brutal. Yo no lo sé, no soy experto ni mucho menos en IA, Powell tampoco, pero bueno, le están haciendo mucha incidencia, y es que Estados Unidos realmente necesita ese estallido de productividad, que ya estamos viendo cómo va subiendo mucho, es bueno para justificar este enorme endeudamiento, y también ese mandato dual que tiene la Fed y Powell, que es el pleno empleo, la estabilidad de la divisa, y el tercer mandato que nadie lo habla, que es la estabilidad financiera, que los mercados no tengan mucha volatilidad. De hecho, mucha gente habla de la Reserva Federal como un gran hedge fund que se ocupa de velar por los mercados financieros. Bueno, muy interesante todo lo que dice Powell. Vamos a ver vuestra opinión también a través del chat que tenemos en YouTube, ir comentando cosillas que os quiero leer. Vamos de nuevo a escuchar al presidente de la Fed. Vamos con Powell.
For all of us, and
So it boils down to two things. One is, we have a specific mandate. Stick to that mandate. Focus on that mandate, and don't be dragged into partisan political fights around. I mean, when I testify, people are always trying to get me and my colleagues to support their perspective on, fiscal issues or immigration issues, and they think of an economic hook, and they try to. But we just don't do that. That's part of it. The other part of it just is, I spend a lot of time in our system of government, oversight comes through Congress. In a parliamentary system, it's through the elected government, but because that's the same people who are in the parliament. But for us, it's not the administration that has legal oversight responsibility. It's the Congress, the House and the Senate, and particularly the two oversight committees, one in the House, one in the Senate. And so my colleagues and I spend a lot of time, and we don't go up there to blast talking points at people. We want to hear what they're thinking, and we want to listen carefully and respectfully and tell them what we're thinking. And I think people appreciate that. That's the thing. Same thing internally. I think when you listen respectfully and understand what people are saying and try to think about how to incorporate that thinking into what you're doing, for most people, most of the time, that's going to be enough. And so they can go along with things that they don't 100% support, but they feel like they were heard, or they're not going to maybe criticize quite as harshly as they would, because they realize that you're doing this in good faith to the absolute best of your ability and based on the actual facts and what we know about the ever-evolving economy.
And can I just ask about how your own background has helped in this process? So you are a person who has shifted between the public and the private sector over the course of your career. And you're a lawyer by training. You don't have an economics PhD. You're running an organization which is mostly a PhD, or many PhD economists. So can you just speak about how your background has helped you navigate this?
Sure. So when I graduated from college, I had no plan other than this idea that I liked what I saw of the careers of people like George Shultz or Cyrus Vance, for example. And that the idea was these are people who had a mainly private sector career, but served in the government at intervals and were able to do public service. And I grew up in Washington, D.C. My family was not involved in any of this really, but this is what I observed, and I thought I would like to do that. And by some miracle, that's kind of what happened. It wasn't careful planning. So I always wanted to do public service, and I wound up doing that. I served as an aide on the Hill. I was at all these different things that I've done. So that's how that happened.
And then I'll ask one last question for this. Do you have any advice for the students in this room whose interests are to move between public and private sector?
So I think that's a great plan for people. People have different tolerance levels for volatility. So, I quit the law and went into investment banking, quit investment banking and went into private equity, quit private equity and went into public service. So if you're willing to tolerate volatility and steep learning curves, then if you're that person, then that's a great way to go. The other thing I'll say, though, is I have really found that when I was a partner at a private equity firm, I asked the head of the investment area, what do you look for? It's all about picking good CEOs and good business models. What do you look for in a good CEO? And the answer was, there's no one model. And that's really important. I have seen very different people be successful in leadership roles. Very, very different people. And it's in, I don't know if it's in every person, but it's in a lot of people to find your own way to lead. And you don't have to be one way or another. I can think of one person at the Fed she had a way of being a very soft talker, and by the end of the meeting, everyone was leaving there thinking, how do I do what she said? It's like, I want to do that. It's in everybody, and you should have the self-confidence. What I experienced when I first had to lead things was complete lack of self-confidence. Oh my God, I'm not ready to do this. And I think that's very common for people. I think people get more coaching now, but I would just say, be confident in your own abilities to lead and take things on and take risk, because that will, if I could say that to something to my younger self, I think that would be it.
Jay, we're running on time here, and there's lots more stuff we could talk about, but I'm mindful of time. So let me just first of all thank you on behalf of Stanford for being here, engaging us in this conversation. It's been very stimulating. I know I learned a lot, and I hope we all learned a lot. And again, so thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Audrey. Thank you.
Bueno, aquí estamos viendo cómo acaba la conferencia de Powell ante estos estudiantes de la Universidad de Stanford, al que les ha dado un consejo, un poco justito, ¿no? Diciendo que confíen en sus habilidades. Eso también lo decimos desde aquí, claro que sí. Y al final un resumen el que ha dejado Powell, que ha estado bastante dovish. De hecho, los mercados tampoco se han movido mucho. Ha habido un pelín de volatilidad, pero al fin el resumen es que ha estado lateral. El mercado está bastante lateral. Nosotros, como decía José, había abierto creo que un corto en Nasdaq. Nosotros el que hemos abierto el S&P 500, el que he abierto yo, ya lo había cerrado. Scalpea hoy un par de veces. Y el resumen es que ha dicho por un lado una cosa y por otro otra. Dice que no esperamos recortes en las tasas hasta que tengamos más confianza en que la inflación se acerca al objetivo, no olvidemos, del 2%. Y luego ha dicho que, también ha dicho que dejar los recortes demasiado tarde podría dañar la economía. Esto es como diría mi madre, ¿no? Este hombre habla con ambos lados de la boca, ¿no? Bueno, ahí está Powell. En cualquier caso, recordemos que mañana jueves volvemos con Más que Mercados en el horario normal. Empezamos en apertura de Wall Street a las 3:30 hora española. Hablaremos de esto y, como siempre, de mucho más. Os esperamos a todos. Pasar un fenomenal miércoles. Un abrazo. Chao, chao.
Inversión, macro, bolsa, cripto y mercados. En Más que Mercados, analizamos la actualidad, las últimas noticias y todos los factores que afectan a tus inversiones.
La educación financiera cambia vidas.
De lunes a jueves a las 3:30 p.m. hora española, el mejor programa de economía, inversión y trading de habla hispana. Cada día podrás ver la operativa en vivo y en directo. Acompáñanos con la guía experta de José y Álvaro Basagoiti y analiza con nuestros invitados las mejores estrategias de inversión y los portafolios corporativos de su firma. También podrás hacer tus propias consultas sobre acciones y mercados en tiempo real. Únete a nosotros de lunes a jueves a las 3:30 hora española y no te pierdas las mejores entrevistas e invitados. Descubre cómo hacer crecer tu patrimonio de manera inteligente solo en Más que Mercados de TradingPRO TV.